Hi and welcome back to the shop. In this video I'm going to build a stand-up planter, and I've designed the planter around this plastic insert. If you want to build this project, I'll have a link to the plastic insert down in the description below and a link to the project plans right here. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm building two planters, and here's a look at one that's already finished. I'll get started on the next one by cutting the boards for the top and bottom rails. I've already cross-cut the boards to a rough length, and now I'll use the table saw to rip them to width. Next, I'll use the miter saw to square up one side of each board, then set up a stop block and cut the rails to length. Now that I have the rails for the planter cut to size, I'll move on to the stiles for the front, back, and sides of the planter. First, I'll cut the boards to a rough length. That'll make them easier to handle over at the table saw. With all the boards cut to width, I put a straight edge on one side of each board, set up a stop block, and now I'll cut all the stiles to length. I'm building the planter with pocket hole screws, and the next step is to measure and mark 1 inch from each side to drill the pocket holes. If you've watched any of my other project videos, you've probably seen me use my fingernail as a guide like that, and that's a trick that anybody can learn. It's very useful. It's a major time saver. As you can see, I only had to measure once, and now I'll just continue to mark all the boards where the holes need to be drilled. Now I have all the pocket holes drilled, and I'm almost ready to assemble the parts. But before I do that, I'm going to use a chamfer bit in the router and add a small chamfer to the outside edge of the stiles. Now I'm ready to assemble the parts with the pocket hole screws. And I wanted to mention, when you're cutting the chamfer, make sure you don't cut a chamfer on the outside edge, or you'll end up with this, and that's a mistake. It's a very easy mistake to make, so that's why I wanted to point it out. So when it comes to assembling the parts, everything goes face down. Make sure your straight edge is on the outside. And as far as the centerpiece, I'm just going to eyeball it in the center. Now that I have the front and back and the two sides put together, the next step is to drill more pocket holes on the inside so I can attach these parts to the legs. I'm building the legs with 8/4 material, and I'll get started by rough cutting the boards to length. Next, I'll use the table saw to square the legs up to 1 3/4 inches. Okay, now I've got the legs nice and squared up. The next step is to cut them to length, and I'll square up one side of each leg, and then put the square side against the stop block and cut all the legs to length. If we take a look at the planter that I've already built, you can see there's a slight taper on the outside of the legs, but there's also a slight detail at the top of the leg, and that's made by setting up a stop block and then cutting a 7-degree angle on all 4 sides of the leg, and that creates this kind of a shallow pyramid. It's a very subtle detail, but I think it makes a difference. Now that I have the legs squared up, cut to length, and that little detail added at the top, the next step is to add a slight taper on the two outside facing sides of the legs. To cut the taper, I'll use this tapering jig. You want to make sure that the top of the leg is at the top of the jig. That's a simple mistake that you can easily make, so just a quick reminder. I've also put an X on what represents the inside of the leg for the first cut. This X will be against the fence. After making that cut, I'll rotate the leg one time and make the second cut. This is the square side of the leg where the parts of the planter will be attached. Now that I have the legs tapered, I'm almost ready to put the planter together. But before I do that, I'm going to use a cove bit in the router and put a small cove detail at the bottom of the front, back, and sides. I'm going to attach the sides to the leg first, and I made this little jig so the parts are all attached to the leg at the same height. So you can see that the side is going to bottom out into this jig. I made another spacer jig for the back. I want the jig to be flush with the back of the leg. And then I'm going to clamp this piece right here so when I drive the screws, this part doesn't walk forward. Let's call this a stop block. I've got it clamped in place on both sides. That prevents this piece from walking forward as I drive the screws. And I've got my spacer block here, so I'm exactly 3/8 of an inch from the back of the leg. I just realized I'm not going to be able to drive the screws because I forgot to drill the holes. So I'll do that in a minute. In the meantime, I did drill the holes on this side, so I'll go ahead and attach it to the leg. And I'll make sure that the cove is facing down. Jeez, there we go. That's better. I've also got two quick clamps holding this piece in position. Now that I have the sides assembled, the next step is to use the same process and attach the front and back. Now that I have the planter assembled, the next step is to attach a cleat on the inside of the front and back that will support the bottom. Since this piece of wood is not going to be seen, you can use any wood species that's suitable for exterior use. I'm using a piece of white oak that's been hanging around the shop for a while. After cutting the cleats to fit, I'll pre-drill and countersink evenly spaced holes to attach the cleats to the inside of the planter. For the top of the planter, I'm adding a piece of what I'm calling cap molding, and that's going to have the same cove detail as I have here in the bottom. I'll get started by using the table saw to rip the molding at 1.5 inches. Next, I'll use the router with the same cove bit to add a small cove to the outside bottom of the molding. I'll attach the cap molding with stainless steel screws and keep the back of the molding flush with the back of the leg. I'll make the bottom of the planter out of 1x6 pine. Again, this is a part of the project that will not be seen, so any scrap wood that you have hanging around the shop that's suitable for outdoor projects will work. I gave the planters a good sanding and rounded over the bottom of the legs just a little bit to help prevent tear out when the planter is moved around or dragged around on the floor. I also added nylon domes to the bottom of the legs. This will lift the planter off the ground a little and allow for air circulation and prevent the end grain of the legs from sucking up moisture. I'm finishing this project with Total Boat's teak oil. I'll apply the finish with a brush and let it sit there for a few minutes and then wipe it off in the direction of the grain with a clean rag. Okay, well, I'm real happy with the way this project turned out, and of course, if you want to build it, I'll have a link to the plans right here, and you can also check out all of my other woodworking project plans. They all have free video tutorials right here on YouTube, so I think it's a great value. I think one of the hardest things about woodworking is really knowing what to build and how to get started. It doesn't matter if you've been doing this for 6 months or 30 years, that is still always the very first step when you're ready to start a project. So again, I hope that you'll check out the plans and let me help you with your next project. This planter is made with pocket hole screws simply because I think it's a more inclusive project using pocket hole joinery. If you have a domino and you'd like to build this with a domino, the plans and cut list are the same, so you could go ahead and do that. The idea of using the plastic insert, I think it's just a good idea. It allowed me to have the openings a little bit wider here, which I think adds to the design. It'll prevent the planter from rotting out as quickly. And you can also use this planter indoors. I think it would look great underneath a window. You could have a little indoor garden. So yeah, fun project. I really enjoyed it. If you do build this, go ahead and share it on Instagram and tag me. I'd love to see what you made. As always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.